Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I share my recent appearance on the Resilience Unraveled podcast with Dr. Russell Thackeray titled Trends in Organizational Development.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Westover. And it's very rare for me to do this, but I was a guest on his podcast, and I enjoyed my time with him so much. We had such a fascinating chat. I thought it would be really useful to redo it in reverse, as it were, and have Jonathan here with me today, joining us in the UK and saying hello and chatting about some interesting subjects. So first of all, hi, John.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm excited to have the chance to have another conversation with you. Like you said, we had a really fun discussion. What was it, a couple months ago?
Yeah,
time flies.
Yeah.
So I lose track, but I'm coming to you here from Utah in the United States, and it's very hot here right now. We've been having weather up towards 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is quite warm, but it's a beautiful time of year.
It's gorgeous, isn't it? Summer's a great time of the year, isn't it? Only if you can get out into it, I suppose. So tell everyone around my neck of the woods what it is you get up to. What is it you do? How would you describe what it is you do?
Yeah, I'd like to think of myself as a scholar practitioner. So I'm a full-time associate professor at the university near my home, Utah Valley University in Utah. I've been there for about 11 years. I am a professor and chair of the organizational leadership department, and I do quite a few things on campus in relation to my teaching, which is all around organizational development and change, human resource management, organizational behavior, leadership, ethics, those sorts of topics. And all of my research is related to global comparisons in worker engagement, worker satisfaction, and the drivers of worker motivation across the world. And I have two dogs that are in the background and are excited. So that's the academic side of what I do. But I do a lot, I try to do a lot of really practitioner-oriented work. I do consulting on the side with my consulting business, Human Capital Innovations. Part of that is I run a podcast that you were a guest on, the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. And we also release webinars and lots of original research and other content, the goal of which is to help organizational leaders learn how to better manage their people, how to improve their leadership skills, have those difficult discussions in the workplace, and ultimately to be able to have high functioning organizations and teams where they're maximizing the potential of their people. So in a nutshell, I suppose that's a big nutshell, but in a nutshell, that's what I do on the academic and the practitioner side. And then I also, you'll hear noises in the background from time to time. I have a large family. I have 6 children. My wife is also a professor. She teaches math, and we're all working from home and doing school from home right now.
Wow.
Because of COVID. So it's an adventure.
And then everybody's interested in the dog. So K8 and K9, I suppose they're called.
That's right. We have a Brittany and we have a Cavachon, a mid-sized dog and a little dog, and they're best friends. So it's a lot of fun.
Very good. So I guess it's been a trend in the academic world to have come up with interesting ideas, to have stretched the boundaries, to have pushed forward some of the meaning and ideas over the course of the last 20 or 30 years in organizational design and leadership and all those sorts of things. And there's been an academic front and there's been a practitioner front. And I get the sense there's nothing really new at the moment. Is that fair?
You know, it depends on what you mean by new. I mean, I think we're always pushing the edge of known, the edge of truth, the edge of knowledge, and we're refining methodologies, and we're getting better at explaining phenomenon. So the statistical techniques used today, versus even when I went through my PhD program 15 years ago, they're more advanced, and so we can have more precision, and we can have a little bit more detail into what we're trying to understand and the complexities of the interacting variables. So I think the methodological advancement is definitely there, which then does lead to insights in the theoretical world as it relates to the practical world, for sure. But largely, yeah. I mean, I think if we're talking about the general fields of organizational behavior, the major principles, the major theories have been in place for decades now, and there's little tweaks and adjustments and repackaging and putting a new kind of label on it. So that is continually happening. But in terms of like substantive advancement in like some of those core theories, I haven't really seen that for a while.
Why is that, do you think?
That's a good question. I mean, some of it is, frankly, a lot of what we do isn't rocket science, and so when some of these, like, for example, when organizational behavior emerged as its own discipline, originally it was an amalgamation of all the different social sciences and their take on organizations. So you had the sociology of organizations, you had industrial organizational psychology, you had anthropologists, political scientists, so on and so forth. All the different disciplines were, there was a little piece of that discipline that would focus on organizations. And over time, probably more like 50 years ago, they started to coalesce into like one standalone discipline, which was organizational behavior. And you still have organizational sociology and IO psych and all of those. And that's actually what I did. I did my PhD in organizational sociology. But you have this organizational behavior kind of interdisciplinary collection of work. And they started to uncover decades ago some of the driving fundamental phenomenon influencing human behavior, group behavior, effective leadership, so on and so forth. And a lot of it really isn't rocket science. It's sometimes I would say it's just really common sense type stuff that often people forget when they get into the daily grind of just trying to run a business and deal with people and put out fires. And also, we just have a tendency to revert back to our baser tendencies and, human nature. And so we end up doing dumb things over and over again when we're in leadership roles and when we're working in organizations. And so part of it is just reminding people again and again and again some of those basic principles, so they can be effective. They can be effective leaders, effective communicators, effective collaborators, drive innovative cultures, etc. So there's been refinements for sure, but a lot of the major theories I think have largely been there. One thing that I would like to consider, I think it's reasonable to consider myself one of the leading experts in relation to my own research is global comparative studies as it relates to organizations. And one of the things that I did in my dissertation, I've done dozens of times since in other peer-reviewed articles since finishing my doctorate, is just demonstrate the complexity of global systems as they influence organizational dynamics and the motivations of employees. And so one of the things I think we've fallen into the trap in, particularly in the Western world, as it relates to like the discipline of organizational behavior, is to say, to make the argument that, you know, this theory that came out of like the University of Michigan, you know, back in the 80s, it's been replicated a bunch of times. It's been demonstrated to be, generalizable. And so now we're just going to take it and apply it in every different context, every country around the world. And the reality is that just doesn't work very well. So any advancement, I think, in the field of OB and leadership largely has been to recognize the necessary contextualization of those theories and their application, because it's not the same in the US. You know, the UK and the US, we have a lot of similarities. There are differences too, but largely we're similar. But you start to consider, you know, the US versus, you know, China or Singapore, or you go into Africa or whatever, you know, you start to make those comparisons, and these commonly accepted generalizable models start to break down. And so I've demonstrated that over and over again as I test models across different contexts and show, you know, how they don't fit as well. And I think that's important to know, because that means that researchers within those contexts can and should continue to pursue understanding and knowledge within that specific context, so they can drive successful behaviors, successful communications, successful organizational structures and design, to help people find meaning and fulfillment and success, you know, not just in the US, not just in the UK, not just in Western Europe, but in, you know, any place that you might find yourself doing work.
I'm excited to announce the publication of my new book from HCI Press, The Alchemy of Truly Remarkable Leadership: Ordinary, Everyday Actions that Produce Extraordinary Results. Consider how the nature of work has shifted over the past 50 years. With increased globalization, rapid technological advancement, and the shift in economic composition, the average job of today looks very different than the average job of 50 years ago. What will the jobs and organizations of tomorrow look like? Moreover, what does this all mean for organizational leaders? What are the core competencies and capabilities of organizations and their leadership that are prepared for continued disruption and geopolitical and socioeconomic shifts? Regardless of what the future holds, increasingly, leaders need to be socially minded, data-driven, decisive, champions of talent, and disruptors of the traditional notions of leadership, teams, organizations, and work. The Alchemy of Truly Remarkable Leadership will help you to explore your own leadership competencies and capabilities and consider ways to apply and implement them into your workplace and personal life.
You think that westernization, that McDonald'sization of the world is actually part of the issue? You're right, I work a lot in Africa, and you know, I'll sit there and say, where's the African model of leadership? Because actually the very fabric of African culture is completely different. And they seem to look to the US, UK world, the big thinkers in our worlds, and say, okay, what do they say? And then you broadly work with them. And broadly, it doesn't work. And you're saying that. Well, but where's the Chinese model? Where is it? And, is there something about the aggressive push of our ideas around the world, which is actually making everything quite so bland? And actually the failure to allow ideas to travel the other way is the thing that's actually stopping new ideas coming out. Because actually, if you look at every market in the world, none of them are like the US. I mean, bits of the US are not like the broad idea of what the US is, isn't it? I mean, having been there for some while, it's quite peculiar what the US is really like. And yet it seems to have such an intellectual grip on things. And surely now is the time to challenge it, when there seems to be a slight paucity of inspiration coming out of the place.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. Largely, I mean, you can go back to colonial roots in the spread of Western culture, and all of that, I think, leads to why it is the way it is. But you're right, regardless of those drivers and those reasons, so many different places around the world kind of by default look to the West, for these types of explanations and for best practices. And frankly, running a successful tech company in Silicon Valley, is probably not going to look the same as running a successful tech company in India, And so there are going to be similar principles that will apply across contexts likely, but there's going to be major differences as well that if you don't take into account, into your models, you're just going to end up doing, you're going to beat your head against the wall and you're going to wonder, why isn't this working? And then that sometimes leads to people making false assumptions or coming to false conclusions about the inferiority of the workforce. They're not, the human capital isn't skilled enough. They don't know, they're lazy. Some of those stereotypes start to emerge, and it has, really nothing to do with the inferiority as some may claim of this foreign workforce. It has everything to do with, the management style, the organizational structure, the way the work is designed, and it's designed for, workers in the US. It's not designed for workers in India, just as an example.
Yeah.
So, we just need to be really careful about that. But people don't like to hear that, especially big corporations don't like to hear that, because they like predictability, they like certainty, they like consistency, and the preference would be, most leaders would like to see, kind of general policies, procedures, practices, culture that's more or less uniform across locations. And that might work okay when you're in Western Europe and there's not as much difference across cultures. But man, when you're a multinational firm and you're in 50 different countries, and I mean, it's just not going to work that way. And you're just going to run into frustrations over and over again.
Yes. It's interesting. I'm wondering whether the actual creation of the OD, as we call it in our world, practice has been at the robbing or at the expense of all those individual little sub practices, and almost creating these big amorphous departments gets in the way of doing unique and small research. I think to myself, I'm an OD person as well, and I just wonder whether we've created this thing called OD, but actually we've forgotten what makes it up in the first place, because OD's overtaken its constituent or core elements, and I think we've almost lost that richness. It's interesting you mentioned anthropology. It's, fascinating to think that would have been the anthropology of organizations. That's when was the last time that was discussed? I mean, Harari probably is the last person who's really applied it to a corporate setting, in a sense, hasn't he?
I think that's right. I mean, that's an important thing to consider. And, I mean, personally, I come to OD leadership from the organizational sociology background framing, right? And so, I just noticed that I tend to view things quite differently than someone who's gone through like a traditional OB doctoral program. And people who go through an IO Psych program tend to view things a bit differently too. So I think what you're kind of hitting on, which I agree with, is that the inherent interdisciplinarity of organizational behavior or organizational development as a field requires us to keep an open mind to all of these different subdisciplines that are the contributors that made the field in the first place. And then we have each of those disciplines recognize the necessity of context and how context matters in the understanding of human behavior and human interactions, in this case within the organizational setting. So we have to come back to those roots. And it's so interesting because sometimes I try to publish something and a management journal will say, well, that's more sociology, so send it to a sociology journal. They'll say, oh, well, that's more like psychology, send it to psychology. Or go, send that over here to, political economy, and so I'm like, yeah, the work I do is interdisciplinary. And so it ends up kind of touching on all these different disciplines, and people in the field don't know what to do with it. And so then I end up juggling around trying to figure out where this thing's going to land. so that it can be disseminated and people can, benefit from it, hopefully. But that's the challenge of the interdisciplinary work, because everything in academia has become so niche, that, and so drilled down, that people tend to focus, on these very tiny little specialty areas. And most academics don't do a lot of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary work anymore, because it's just harder to publish. And in the publish or perish environment of academia, that ends up driving the culture.
It's interesting in our world, if you go to a psychological place and they say send it to sociology, that's just an insult. So, so thinking about leadership at the moment, I'm picking up a couple of things from you. One, which is, if you're looking for the next crock of gold under the rainbow, there isn't likely to be one there. But it is perhaps, if you're a leader, to think about, there are probably some really interesting facets hidden in the cracks between these big interdisciplinary areas. Because actually what you're suggesting is that if someone doesn't know how to pigeonhole it, you might have something really interesting in the wrong place. And if you're a leader and you always look in this place for insight, actually looking somewhere else might be an interesting angle. And as you said earlier, that thing about, broad perspective. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but how many of us have this westernized, very rigid view of the world? I mean, how many of us have actually spent time in the Middle East or Africa or the Far East, really engaging ourselves? Because we seem sometimes, especially in American and UK companies, to say that, well, if you go over to Africa, that's going to be career limiting, for somehow, because somehow that's not good enough. So when you come back to where the real action is, that'll be important. And yet those people often come back with a much wider skill set. So maybe that's something we all should be thinking about.
Well, that's certainly my bias. I agree with that. But I'm also someone who, I inherently do, I do, comparative international work in both my research, my teaching, and my practitioner work, my consulting, and I travel a lot. So, that's something that I love, that I feel is really important. The question is how, I buy into that. You're preaching to the choir, but like, how do we convince others of that? And you just, what the situation you just described, where people say it's career limiting to go on this foreign assignment, how do we counterbalance that, so that organizations can learn to embrace the global complexity and learn to thrive more because of a deeper understanding of differing contexts and cultures?
Well, I'll tell you what, the first step for a lot of people is to get hold of you and come to your website and sort of engage a little bit with your work. So just tell us how to get hold of you, John.
Yeah, you can find out more about human capital innovations by going to innovativehumancapital.com. That's our main corporate website. And you can find out more about our team. You can find more about, and our team, by the way, is very interdisciplinary. If you go and look there, you'll see, a whole range of people. The idea being that anytime we go and work on a project for an organization, that we want to put together an interdisciplinary team that can tackle it from all angles, so that we can uncover the deeper challenges that are facing the organization, not just giving surface level Band-Aid type of solutions. So you can find out more about our team. You can find more about our offerings. You can see some of our original research. You can find our podcast there. The podcast is also available on all the major podcast platforms. It's the Human Capital Innovations podcast. We have something like 160 episodes up. We're in about 50 countries, and I would love for people to come and check out the podcast and find out more about what we do. And I'm always happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. Jonathan H. Westover on LinkedIn. You can look me up, and I'd love to have a conversation.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for your time today. It's been a blast. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. It's been fun.
We are excited about the launch of HCI's new magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine designed to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We will be publishing issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. Check out the first issue and let us know what you think. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.